things remain the same. How is social class mainly passed from one generation to another in such a stable way? Okay. So habitus would be something for him group specific. And particularly, he's talking about class all the time. So the question I want to open when you think about, if you choose Bourdieu to think about this universalizing theories, is the theory about social reproduction of habitus can it be applied to other type of movements? Okay. We saw that Louis Vaquan kind of does kind of a Bourdieuian analysis of race relations in the U.S. So you could kind of bring these two together and think like, how successful is he? Like, is thinking about race in the U.S. through the concept of habitus useful? Is it kind of like too obvious? Like, does it give us something else? Does like thinking of race adds to the theory, or is the theory robust enough as it is? Can it be applied everywhere as it is, and we don't need to think about these local knowledges to make it richer? Okay, so that would be like the question you need to ask yourself. Another thing about Bourdieu is that if you remember the logic of practice, he kind of does like a very strong criticism to objectivism and structuralism in particular. Remember like those kind of difficult chapters we read, where he's saying that like scientific knowledge dichotomizes reality and the logic of science is different than the logic of practice itself. So we could think about that in the essay also. So is this such a universalizing theory? He kind of acknowledges that science does this decontamination, but he doesn't seem able, from my perspective, to break through that. He still ends up doing his field analysis with this kind of dichotomic categories, one side and the other, and up and down. So he is science for him, can science transcend this dichotomization? It seems that he thinks that acknowledging it helps the scientist, but he thinks that science in itself partializes reality. Like there is no way out of it. So sociology will always be partializing reality, because interpretation of reality can never be reality itself. Okay? So that's something you can take into account when you're thinking how putting other knowledges would add or not to this theory. And then the other idea I thought about is this idea of classification struggle. Okay, so we saw it in his idea about classes in France, and we saw it also a little bit with Bonilla Silva, this idea of classification struggles in racial groups. So he thinks that like society is much more about classification than about class struggle, right? He's anti-Marxist. He doesn't think that history moves through class struggle, but it's all about distinction and classification. So this seems to be pretty universal. He's putting it as a principle not for France, but everywhere. He thinks people are doing these classifications in one way on another. One question that comes to my mind there is, what about power? Like, who has the power of classifying? And he kind of talk about it a little bit when he says, like, okay, the upper classes kind of dominate this classification struggle because they have the legitimate taste, the legitimate categories, etc. But he doesn't delve very deep into power. So that could be a way, thinking about power, how you could include kind of postcoloniality or feminism or race, whatever you choose to think on how to include it to this theory. How would power play a more prominent role in this theory, or would it help? Would it make it a better theory if we put more power in it? Yeah. So this, you don't have to take any of this kind of ideas. These were the things I was thinking while I was kind of reviewing my Bourdieu. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or questions about this. Yeah, Tim?
Just to kind of go back, like, didn't catch everything you said, but what were you saying about, like, what about power is not enough?
Yeah, I was saying that from my perspective, Bourdieu doesn't put too much attention to power as other authors do. He talks about classification struggles as something that everybody gets involved in. He kind of argues that the most important classification struggles are within the upper classes, so there is some power there, like upper classes can impose their taste as the legitimate one, but power is not very prominent in Sikh theory compared to Foucault or compared to post-colonial studies or others. So this would be a way of thinking how integrating these local knowledges could improve or not his theory. Like, would adding power improve Bourdieu's theory? Is it good enough as it is? That is like one thing that you could think about. Yes. Anybody else? Okay. So neo-Marxism, and here I'm only going to mention Polanyi and Gramsci, but if you want to talk about Burawoy or Eric Wright, could also do it. And it was difficult for me of thinking of these as related, well, it was more difficult with Polanyi than Gramsci to thinking about the theory as universal and how to integrate other local knowledges. In the case of Polanyi, the main argument was that this great transformation is this pass from embedded to disembedded societies, right? And in this kind of theory, he argues that he's kind of anti this Marxist determinism, right? He says like history didn't have to occur in this way. Like basically, liberalism was a historical product and required a lot of work. Required people like to get together, to think of laws, required like government intervention and everything. So in that sense, it's not like such deterministic and universalist as Marx. But then, he seems to think, from my perspective, that pre-market economies are universal, that that's the normal. So you do have like kind of like this universalization, this kind of like, everybody, like the normal thing, the universal thing is that like economy is reliant in society, is part of society. So he's doing there like a kind of an assumption that is pretty universalist. And another assumption that is pretty universalist is this idea that many Marxists would argue against, that this counter-movement idea, that everybody reacts against commodification because commodification threatens life. So it's not about class alliances, it's not about like power, like some people like in a worse position and some getting benefit. From his perspective, liberalism harms everybody, and everybody rebels against commodification. So we have also like that kind of generalization that we could think about if we think about like this racial others, sexual others, colonial others. How could that challenge this idea? I felt in the reading of Polanyi, remember when he talked about kind of like, oh, in these colonies in Africa, everybody helps each other, and so solidarity prevails, and like everybody is working together. I couldn't like read it like when I was kind of reviewing it again without thinking on this concept of Orientalism. He kind of like is kind of like generalizing everybody that's not European as this ideal society in which everybody works together. So there is some kind of Orientalization, and he is constructing Europe as he constructs this other. Right? So we construct like this other in this way. Although he's critical to Europe modernization, he's still doing this dichotomization of the world between like Europe as one thing and the whole other world as something else. So there's a criticism that you could kind of like get into to kind of probably post-colonial studies like add it in some way. Okay, and in Gramsci, the main thing is the theory about hegemony, right? And he talks about hegemony as the strategy of domination that defines the West but not the East. And again, I think in this Orientalization, he talks about like why did the Russian Revolution happen? But then he talks about kind of like interchangeably about like Russia and the East. Like the whole East without civil society and the whole West with this strong, robust civil society. Is it so? Would post-colonial scholars in India agree that there is no intermediate institutions between the state and the market in their societies? Like there might be a critic there that you could think about it. Okay? Something that is important is that Gramsci is a big inspiration for many of the scholars, so it could be a good idea to think about Gramsci and post-colonial studies, just because they were like all this focus on ideology and in culture as a driving force is important for both, right? So I put here, like for Marx, ideology is epiphenomenal. Ideology is just a manifestation, a reflection of the relations of production. But Gramsci and post-colonial scholars take ideology very seriously, right? Ideology is not only a reflection, but it's a driving force. Ideology can produce reality. Okay, so that's another way of thinking of Gramsci and his theories. But you would have to like make yourself the question, like, how would thinking on colonialism improve or not his theory? Is he thinking about it enough? Is his theory strong enough as it is? Or would like post-colonial studies or even feminism or race studies like improve his theory or not, and how? So that's a basic question that you have to ask yourself for every author, okay?
This one's kind of interesting because his theory of hegemony as he's kind of perpetuating it even as he's critiquing the elite.
Yeah.
He's kind of perpetuating it on other societies in the same way as he's
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like he's thinking of hegemony as something like dividing classes, and he's not thinking how he's talking about, like, if you think geographically, how it's also like imposing an hegemony from the West. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
So when we're applying like the perspective, like either neo-Marxist or Hegelian, we always, well not always, but I mean, if we're taking the argument that we should include race, sex, and post-colonialism into sociology, then we would have to kind of apply that to whatever perspective to see if it will hinder or improve the theory.
Yeah. What would it do to its theory? Would it help it? Would it? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's kind of like the question is pretty. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so let's go then to this kind of local knowledges, and let's start with Foucault. So Foucault is, I guess, a hard but very good option, I think, to like way to go in this essay. And we did have several sections about him, so we should be able like, to talk different things about him. And he's very clearly against totalizing theories. He like states that very clearly in the two lectures that we read. He talks about Marxism and psychoanalysis as examples of totalizing theory, but he's generally like an anti-scientific, like he declares himself in that way. And you will have to name him anyway in your essay, because one of the concepts you have to use is that of genealogy. So there's not escape of like mentioning him, but it's your decision how much you use him in your overall essay. So his overall argument in this kind of two lectures is that research should focus on the margins. So in these struggles of resistance to domination, instead of like in the center in domination itself, you shouldn't look at the sovereign, but you should look at how power is applied in the margins of society. Okay? And the trick there, he argues, is how to do this without reducing these margins to a totality as well. And this is kind of like the critique that you can think that Julian Go does for studies. You are totalizing also. Is there an escape of totalization? That would be a great topic for an essay. Like, is it possible, like, not to totalize, like incorporating these theories? Would it imply escaping totalization, or you would still be in some way kind of doing this? Is sociology in its essence, like if we strive to create categories through which we can generalize and talk about reality, is that like totalizing percent? Is there an escape out of it? Can we kind of like balance it in some way? That's a very difficult question, and there's no right answer, but it would be an interesting topic. So the concept of genealogy here is important. So we saw that genealogy is a method of research that assumes that truth is always relative to an order of power, okay?